You know, it's kind of like one of those Ryanair seats. If you don't get in quickly, you don't get a seat. Nobody from Ryanair, but I hope. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to know a little bit about my audience, and I'll tell you a bit about myself. So first of all, once you get the streaming, if you can let people know, get it connected so that those who can't go can watch it streaming, all right? So first of all, thank you to Ryan and to John at the door. So please tell me a little bit about yourselves. How many of you are doing a startup? Okay. How many of you are in a large multinational? Okay. How many of you are working in tech? Okay. How many of you are working on consumer products? Okay. How many of you are working in services? Okay. How many of you are product managers? Okay. How many of you are entrepreneurs? How many of you are working in marketing? In design? Okay, so we've got a fairly broad audience, but I hope that this is going to excite and get you thinking a little bit differently. The kind of talks that we tend to talk about are more about giving businesses and you a competitive edge. You know, the secret sauce is the sauce nobody talks about. So you're going to learn stuff here that you aren't going to find in Lean or in any of that stuff. And some of it is stuff that has kind of lost fashion, but is actually really, really profound. So this is going to be a helicopter view. I'm going to do it extempore because my purpose is really to kind of understand an audience and then see if I can systemize it into a course. Because normally I tend to do this more to help a client get a competitive edge. And I'll talk you through a little bit of my history so you can see this is not some academic coming and giving you some theory. It's stuff that's gone on to make billion-dollar products. All right? So first I'm going to take you the old classical approach. Can everyone see the screen? This is a relatively short talk on that. So the big thing is everybody thinks requirements capture is a bit like sort of catching pound notes with a butterfly net. Yes? No? So in a large company, there's typically a chain. Okay, so if we start with an established company, and I'll talk a bit more also about startups and insights. So you tend to follow this customer sales, customer talks to the salesman talks to marketing talks to product management talks to the designer talks to the developer talks to supplier. Are you familiar with that kind of Chinese whispers? And what tends to happen is everybody from each of those roles takes their own perspective, okay? So there are many different types of needs. There's business issues, social context, current product, competitor information, product plans, and product opportunities. And a lot of the stuff, if you go through product terms and all, don't put enough emphasis on ecosystems and competitors. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So usually, let me ask you a question. What does a product mean? What do you think a product is?
Serving any somebody.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but it's the thing that does the thing. Anyone come across that? Anyone seen Halt and Catch Fire? Yes? Honest to God, it'll take you through the entrepreneur's journey. So anybody who thinks they want to be one of the entrepreneurs will soon learn the real fights that go. How many people, when you're sitting and designing a product, have war between your teammates? Yes? Right? And we'll talk about how to get over that with the concept called shuttle diplomacy. So, but usually what tends to happen is this caused me a lot of problems when I worked for Accenture, because Accenture did a joint venture with BT. And they came very much from, we'll build it bespoke for you. Right? But in BT, the philosophy was very much, we do something very simple, but we do it millions of times, like with the phone call. So the art of a product is to productionize a particular service. Does that make sense? Yeah? Right? So if you're in the business of scaling and making it repeatable, then you take the common features and the common needs and build it into a product or a service. Does that make sense? And then the customer has to live with what you're giving them. Does that make sense? Right? So, if you're lucky enough in an existing product, you might be able to do that, okay? So Apple can kind of forecast what the demand for the iPhone is going to be. But if it's a brand new product, you can't do that. So the product will have attributes, functionality, positioning, look and feel, time to market-led product concept, okay? Each person comes up, so product manager goes to the designer and says, I'd like a knockout product, okay? And what the hell does that mean, right? He goes to the system architect or the technical architect and starts talking about the chemicals that's going to make that product. And then the guy who's making the chemicals goes back to his supplier and starts talking. So in software, that's like writing code. The big danger with that approach is what? How many times have you come across where somebody already has a solution in mind? There was a lovely little thing on LinkedIn yesterday. If you can just excuse me, I'm going to digress for a moment just to kind of give you the modern element of that. Can you see this picture? So this was the different countries. You see? Do you get it? Right? So if you notice, as far as the British are concerned, they'll probably be salt with a cup of tea. The Irish are have alcohol and what problem? Is that the German flag? Belgian flag, right? They've got the solution and then they find the problem. How many of you come across that? So thank you very much, the person from... And the thing you've got to bear in mind is, you can't lose sight of your vision and the problem you are solving. And if you rush too quickly to a solution, right? So when Elon Musk is designing the space shuttle, or not space shuttle, the rocket, anybody know the thinking process that's going on behind the choice of the aluminium versus carbon fiber versus stainless steel? Yeah? No? So, yes, it's a very simple idea to make it reusable because 90% of the cost is the engine and the body, and the fuel is only 10%, so why not make it reusable? But then when you have to engineer it, if you choose too early and say, oh, carbon fiber is a really hot subject, right? It won't stand, or you make the aluminium too thin and it just falls apart. So one of the insights is about requirements and not jumping to solution mode too early. Does that make sense? Have any of you seen that happen in real life? Yeah. Hands up. Okay, so you get down to the detailed design, and that tends to be that conversation. And it's a wonder they ever managed to deliver a product. Does this look familiar, this chain of requirements for anybody in a large company? Yes? And of course, for those of you who watched Halt and Catch Fire, you will remember what tended to happen there was that everybody came with a view and it ended up with a big fight. Huh? They almost shot each other at least 10 times during the series because everybody had a different view of how to solve the problem. So you asked for rice and you got mice. Okay? The other key thing is, how many of you end up with requirements that are too complex? Hands up. Right? Now, Chapman used to say that he put lightness in. into a car. He was the designer for the Lotus car. So how do you put lightness into your product? Right? It is often better to do small drops, and it gets you to focus on what's really important to a customer. And a startup has the same problem, right? You don't have all the money. So a startup, if while it's still trying to validate its model, so you don't necessarily build a scale. You see, if you work in Google, one of the frustrations people have is that every product they make has to work for 1 billion people. So they spend a lot of time in engineering to scale. But when you're validating requirements, you don't need to worry about that. And that's the really lean approach. Okay? We come across all these different things. The customer wants a hot air balloon, and the developer is thinking it's a plane. And this is the big trouble. I think tools are great, but over-reliance on them creates a problem. Would you agree with me? What tools do you guys use? Anybody want to be brave enough to mention a name? I won't shoot you, I promise. For anything, capturing requirements.
Excel spreadsheet.
Excel spreadsheet.
Jira.
Huh?
Jira.
Jira, all right. What else? Okay. So we'll come back to that issue in a minute. So the product that the customer wants is not necessarily the one that you end up developing. And the reason I also talk about this is once a product gets out there in the wild, the ecosystem changes.
No.
Do you follow what I'm saying? Right? The product has an impact in customer perceptions, and also you can't even take it back. Because if you're used to a particular UX, do you remember the story about what happened with eBay when they tried to change the yellow background? Does anyone remember that? Okay. eBay, when it first came out, had a yellow background. Do you remember that? Now, we all know that if you look at yellow too long, what happens to your eyes? You get fatigued, right? I can go into circles and how your eyes adjust to it, but you will overload. It's kind of like listening to loud music all the time. So it's a visual equivalent. So yellow is good in small bits, but if you have to stare at a yellow screen, right? Or you have to look at a red carpet all the time, it can fatigue and overload your system. So when they changed it, there was a big revolt because people felt lost. So what did they then have to do? They wrote a program that over the space of a year, it gradually toned down and shifted from yellow to white. So once your product gets out in the wild, it's very difficult to change the customer expectations. Am I making sense? Everybody agree with it? Right? What's the best example of something that has become a standard, though the original constraint isn't there? All of you use it. Does anybody not use a keyboard? Do you remember the original design of the QWERTY keyboard was designed so that all the letters didn't jam up? And it was designed to slow the typist. Do you know that story? Okay, go back and look at it. So very often Y2K problems that something is engineered because something was constrained. And when you're designing, you design to use things that are free. Like, why did they make a car? If they had to pay for oxygen, we wouldn't be driving a motor car. Do you follow what I mean? If you go to Gilda's Constant, so good design or whatever will use what is there for free. Does that make sense? Okay. So, how long do you think some of the planes are flying for? What do you think the shelf life of an aeroplane is? How many years?
40.
It's over 40. Did you know that? Even the biggest Airbus, the A380, is now 10 years. So think about from when it originally started to when it came. Right? So when your product goes in field, if you're thinking about upgrade parts or whatever, because in a consumer world we tend to think about throwaway mobile phones, but if you're going to spend £2,000 on a Samsung, how many cycles do you want it to last? What's its upgrade path going to be? Does it make sense? So when you make the decisions to go into production, let's take you're a program developer, the language you choose I mean, there are still software probably running in Bank of Ireland written in COBOL. Does anybody know COBOL? Huh? You know COBOL?
I don't know. I know Paul.
Right? So in fact, that is actually the most valuable skill. If you know a defunct language, you can become very valuable. So think about your upgrade path. How are you going to move the customer becomes another part of managing the change problem. Is this making sense? Okay. So what I'm going to try to cover is a little bit of a journey, and really it's about the process rather than about the tools. Does that make sense? The tools are really just designed to help you with thinking. Think of it like when you build a house, you put scaffolding around it. Does that make sense? So all these documents that you make roadmaps and all, their purpose is scaffolding. But really, the effect you're trying to solve is the problem for the customer. I mean, let me ask you a question. Why did people have electricity wired to the house rather than putting a generator? That was your original cloud service. Same thing with the phone. Why didn't they just buy point to point? Do you follow what I'm saying? So within a model, if you have a need that's common enough, that's how you figure out, hey, everybody needs a telephone. When Graham Bell originally invented the telephone, he originally thought, when he was asked what they thought they'd use his great invention for, he said it was to wire music from the concert hall. But the way it's being used in the field is being used for everything, right? For people to talk to their children, for children to talk to each other, for people to have a business call, for traders to trade. So the product has a lot of different services. So now I'm going to get back to a little bit here. So have any of you come across a chap called Donald Reinerstein? Anybody heard of him? Okay. He wrote an absolutely fantastic book which people have forgotten about called Developing Products in Half the Time. Okay? And the reason I mention it, everybody used to rush into specs and all, and he introduced a framework which was really about looking at your, can everybody hear me? Is this working? Oh. Called Benefits, Advantages, Features. Have any of you come across this approach? Can you write it down? So, whenever you're thinking about the customer, what benefit or what problem are they solving? And then what advantage does your product give compared to your competitors? And then focus on the features. Okay? How many roadmaps are just being feature lists? And how many projects are from feature creep and designed by committee? Hands up? Only 2 hands. God, you must work in fantastic companies. So early on, I said to you, a product it's the thing that does the thing, right? So you don't necessarily need to own the phone, and you can see this, for example, with storage. So we moved from hard disk storage to SSD storage to USB storage to it being in the cloud. How many of you use cloud storage? There's a case in point, right? So there's a couple of generic patterns. One is called idealization. Any of you who will come to my innovation talk, I talk about idealization, right? So more often than not, what you're often doing with a product is actually taking away the disadvantage of the product, like a short battery life or it not being hard enough or tough enough. Does this make sense? Yes?
Yes.
You agree? So, but people don't actually want the thing. I mean, there are certain things you want for status, but generically, especially in a minimalist world, we don't want to own it, right? Do we? If you want to own it, it is because it has some other attribute. And very often the customer requirements, so let me give you an example of a very simple insight, but it required the change of the entire production line. How many of you have a PC? How many of you have a Mac? When you buy that device, does it come ready to go? Can you switch it on the minute you get it?
Yeah.
Okay. When they were first developed, whether it was a Nokia phone whether it was a PC, the very first task you had to do was plug it in for 4 hours. Does anybody remember those times? Come on, hands up. Right? But that simple insight, do you know who came up with that insight? It was Steve Jobs. He did it for the Mac. He said, why did he? He wanted the joy. If you're a child with a toy, do you want to wait till after Christmas Day to buy batteries and use it? Or do you want it ready to go? Right? So one of the things that people do is a product may evolve from an existing product, like you have a pizza restaurant and you start to deliver it. But the requirements for a delivery pizza is different from the pizza made in a restaurant. What are the requirements for a pizza? Delivery pizza.
Faster.
Okay, how many of you have had a soggy pizza? A soggy pizza. Okay, how many of you have had a cold pizza? Are those is that what you want from a delivery pizza? Huh? Do you get what I'm saying? So when we start to take something into service from a product, the thing changes. Does that make sense? It's very difficult when you guys don't give me some feedback. Come on. Huh? Be merciful. Huh? Right? So trying to figure out what the thing is that is really important to the customer, that the customer will buy your product. Right? How many of you guys use online banking? Okay. How many of you have used a BI product? Business intelligence, analytics. So how many of you use pivot tables? Wouldn't it be great? Very simple thing for a bank to do. To give you your statements, you can pivot and search it. Right? Huh? I'll tell you why they don't do it, but that's actually what you want, because the thing has changed. The expectation has changed. So if you can do it for your company, wouldn't it be useful that you could do a search or an alert or 50,000 other things? Anyone here from a bank? I'm not having a go at just one bank, but that's the bit that people really work. Am I right? Would you use that service? If you could search it, set an alert when a bill is paid? Huh? Be able to rotate it, analyze your thing. Now, of course, if you have a Coutts bank account or you have a Black Amex card, they actually give it to you. But, I don't want to set the wrong expectations. All right? So we talked about what is the product. So the product is about taking a generic set of requirements. In fact, let me just try and explain it to you a bit better. Have you ever come across this graph here? So price, volume, can you see this one? So normally what a product does, and this calculates the utilities, it fixes a price point, and there are some people who would pay more, okay, and then there's a bunch of people, so everybody in this area here is very happy, okay, and these people wouldn't pay for it because they value it less. Right? And then what you try to do is to do bespoke pricing, or you do fragmentation, or you do a product portfolio approach. So when you build your anchor points, you may actually give different products to different people, right? So you might see price for students, price for old people. So you're pricing your thing, or you make minor differences like iPhone. It uses the same architecture in terms of processors, but it might have a shiny thing, so you pay a bit more for it. Is this making sense? Right? Have you ever thought about, so when you design and think about things like product portfolios, which customer, and also when you do a startup journey, it's very important. So like when I launch new products, my original customers is there to see for the next round. So when Facebook launched, it aimed at the Ivy League colleges, and that set it to be a fashionable, trendy product because young people like the new thing too. Is this making sense? And that sets your anchor points for the following. So when I try to tell people, I say, think of your journey like you planning a roadmap to take the Voyager space journey across the world, across the universe. So your first stop might be to Mars and then to Venus, and you'll get a slingshot effect from that to take you to another thing. So if you're developing products, you make one minor version, enterprise, small businesses, individual. Have you noticed that with Microsoft's pricing? Yes? No? How many of you have a student version of Microsoft? There you go, right? But it's priced that way. Then how many use the corporate version? Am I making sense? So when you're starting to map your products, think about these things that I'm taking you through. So we talked about trying to make it scalable, repeatable, reliable. So very often the journey, so if you go to a large company, they will set up standards. Oh, I forgot one other thing, maintainable. How many of you write code that's maintainable? Huh? Right. And that's why, that's the difference in going to Google and you hacking some code at home yourself. Do you follow what I'm saying? So if you want somebody else to be able to maintain it, you write it differently, and that creates an overhead. Am I making sense? Then you get into version control and all of that stuff and testing. So I want you to think about this. Your job is to make the cheapest product, value engineered, to meet the customer's needs in terms of features, functionality, form, that is perceived to be better, different from a customer perspective. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Louder.
Yes.
Have you ever come across that before? Have you?
Value engineering.
Okay, value engineering is just one term. Whenever you're trying to make something, if you give something that has cost you more than it needs to, that's what Lean Agile was actually supposed to try to get you to. Does it make sense? Right? And one of the ways you do it is if you're short of time and constraints make you think creatively. There's a beautiful book called The Beautiful Constraint, which teaches you the power of constraints. So another key thing that you're trying to do when you're trying to scale is to minimize risk. So there's a world of difference between leading edge and bleeding edge. How many of you are making leading edge products? Does Apple make leading edge products? Yes? Can you put your hand up, please? It's bleeding edge, isn't it? It's so new, so radical. They're giving you a quantum computing telephone, are they? Apple are known to de-risk everything to help. Go ahead.
What's the difference between leading edge or leading edge?
Leading edge is like, it is perceived as new. Leading edge is all the products and things. Sorry, I meant bleeding edge. Does Apple make bleeding edge products? Because usually the guinea pig is the customer and you. You know what I mean? And that's the premium you pay for doing it first. You know what I mean? So, because once it's been done the first time, everybody can replicate it because it's easy to copy. Yes? And the biggest risk you've shown is that it is possible or that a market exists. And very often large companies' entire strategy is to copy, not to lead. Right? It doesn't go into bleeding edge. Okay? Then it can make it scalable. So the downside can be, can lack a bit of passion. So another key element, like I said, is the product, especially if it's a consumer product, the concept of self-image. How many of you guys use user personas? Okay, so do you know the difference between a role and a user persona? Okay, I'll come back to that later on. Just hold that thought, okay? I've got a lot to go through here. So, one of the things you need to really do, and this is where you have to be pregnant with the thought, is to say, what problem are you solving? What need are you fulfilling? And it's not about implementing features. Yeah? Because that's the difference between outcomes versus output. How many times have you come across where somebody's just done output for the sake of output? Right? Whereas the real thing is, is it joy the customer wants? Is it self-image? So when people buy a Porsche and they do the study, what was the biggest reason for people buying a Porsche?
So they own Porsche.
Huh?
So they own a Porsche.
Yeah. What they want to do is status-wise tell the world they have arrived. Right? This is the same methodology that Trump used to figure out what message to give. Right? This is what we call this, the psychometric analysis. Right? So it's not about ABC, income or features. It's about what do I need to do. And if to say you've arrived, so there's many different ways people say they've arrived. They can either pimp their car or they buy a well-known brand. Right? Am I making sense? And that has actually nothing to do. The fact that it does 100 or 2 miles is the justification, but they don't actually. How many people drive Porsches at 150 miles day in, day out? Nobody. Right?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Connecting what you just said to what you have on the screen. So that guy that has it, he can solve that problem with a Porsche or a Rolex. So when you start identifying the problem you are solving, you're not on product development just yet.
No, you can be within a particular space, but you're not into the solution yet. You know, so if you take, at the moment, Samsung in their new phone have launched, at the moment, most of these things work with either, how many of you have fingerprint sensors on your phone? Right? So, the current technology is typically based on cameras or heat, right? It reads the capillaries. So the next version that Samsung are doing is, or it's capacitive, right? But the real problem it's solving is I want to keep my phone secure, but I want to be going very quickly, right? If you came up with a product that said every time to use your phone, I'm going to prick it and give my blood sample and DNA, I don't think there'd be a high requirement for that. And though it would be very, very secure. Am I making sense? And so the technology on how you make is about finding the one that meets your price point and scalable issues. Do you know what I mean? So you might have chosen the solar model, you know, the sound thing there, but it would have been too early, it wouldn't be reliable enough. So what Apple makes sure is that when you get it, it'll work. Yes? Now, has that answered your question? So don't rush to the solution, and then you can, so sometimes you need to build it into the product, whereas usually what people do is they do marketing as an afterthought. Just to answer your question, I'm just going to explain the way I do things. What I do is I say a business has 4 squares that you have to answer to build a business. And if your goal is to build a business for an exit, this is, unless you're doing an acqui-hire project. So the first thing is, how am I going to sell it to the customer, which I call my persuasion model. So to make the product more sellable, part of the feature is it's gold, or it's black, or it's shiny, okay? So that fits with this overlap here, can you see there? Then it's, how do I make the product? The innovation and the product development design fits here. Then it's, how do I engineer my company? So this is my cost model, I call it. So do I in-house it? Build it in-house? Do I outsource it? And the 4th element is your culture. Okay? So these 2 things overlap here. Okay?
It's like company culture.
Company culture, and then the subtext is also how you work together. Because, you know, how many people are happy with their company culture and the policies and procedures they put in? Okay, very good. So let us carry on with that as an example. Let's take the government has a regulation that it wants us to stop drink driving. Have you seen the fiasco that's happening about it? You know there's a rule now that if you're over the limit and you're drinking, you lose your license. How many people know that? Okay. Now, you know they're talking about amending it because there's been an uproar that if you happen to have a hardship case, they're going to allow you to drive the car to and from work. Right? Now, what is a different way to solve the problem? That's one, but human behavior being that, you could very easily ask the car manufacturers to put in that you do a breathalyzer before the car gets started. And if it fails the test, the car won't start. So that's one way to implement it, which they could have made and brought it out in the rules. Guess which product they did that for? Huh?
Tesla.
Now, which product did the government make you put in a car? It was called a seat belt. Do you see what I'm saying? So, the outcome you want has to be driven by what the goal is. But if you rush to a solution and say, I'm going to make a legislative framework, and then you find it doesn't work and you start putting these other caches, people don't know where they stand. Am I making sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. So another thing to worry about is there are costs. You know, one of the things is when product gets very long and complicated, you end up with these opportunity costs. And for startups particularly, they run out of money before they have a viable business model. So the key element again is focus. So the key point that I'm trying to make is a company starts with a vision, then it gets downstreamed into the vision of the product. So if you look at Google, Google has a vision about making all the information accessible, and then it has a vision for its search engine product. Is it making sense? So, and the beauty about a vision is very, very simple. It allows your team to make decisions. Every time you have to validate, so to answer complexity of requirements, all you do is go back to your vision statement. So if you take Southwest Airlines schedule is to be the low-cost airline. Any of you familiar with Southwest? So Ryanair is modeled on Southwest. So for example, if a product manager comes up and says, I'd like to give customers a Caesar salad or caviar, it's very easy to go back to the mission statement. You don't need to go back. Or if you said, I'm going to do confetti or something that's going to delay the turnaround time. So alignment to vision is your final test. Right? And that's what, so what are you trying to do? What's the problem is this making sense?
Yeah.
You like this? Or anybody disagree with me, feel free to disagree. All right, you haven't paid, so it's fine. If you paid, you'd be a little bit more circumspect, you'd value it more if you paid for it. But anyway, so when it gets complex, it gets bigger to test, right? So how many of you have sat in groups and committees or even within co-founders and just added a list to get somebody's buy-in? Right? So what I'm going to do is I rush straight into this. I want to take you through a little journey of the projects I worked on. Right? Maybe it's earlier. So I think I've lost a couple of slides. So a little bit about my background. Originally, I came to Ireland as a child and we had a chain of shops. So we introduced Indian goods and a lot of things. So we had shops in Grafton Street and all. So some of the products I went to buy that we introduced in Ireland were things like slipper socks and booties. Anybody remember those? We brought them here. Perfume candles, we developed the market, right? So that was us as a child. So this goes back 30 odd years ago. Then I went to work for ICI as a trainee accountant. Then I went to work for Diageo. Now, what I always sought to do in all the work was to systemize and productize it. So when I went to BT, one of the first things I did was I systemized all the internal services, email and so on. And when we launched the intranet, we had to come up, do you remember, we used to be talking about the killer app? Anyone remember those days, the dot-com era and all of that? So, do you know what the killer app to launch the intranet was? Like when I went to start trying to roll it out, and this was a technology, we got to get this out there. We couldn't get content, so we'd go to the manager, say, here's a free PC, put your content. They didn't want to share their content. They said, we'll only do it when everybody in the company has a PC and has access to it, right? So the first killer app we did was a directory. Now when I was in Diageo and I had taken the telephone directory of the company and put it in the PC, people laughed at me. but yet this was one of the killer apps. And even now, directory products are a very important thing. In fact, there's an entire history I can talk about launch of directory. So then I started developing, so I systemized SAP when I did that in Price Waterhouse. So I launched that service. So my background, then I did clinical trials online, I launched the intranet, and the big award that I got, and if any of you go to my LinkedIn profile, is that I developed low-cost internet. So what I had noticed way back from the 80s and 90s was, any of you ever use bulletin boards and dial-up? Huh? Okay. So I started to notice the behavior. What had typically happened was people put acoustic couplers or modems at the end of the network because they couldn't change the network. And the only product that they sold would be X25 and private circuits, which are very expensive. So if you wanted to connect this branch to that branch with a private circuit, a telco would charge you $6,000, right? So, so big businesses had data lines. So my aha moment was, what if we moved, and you remember ISPs, how many of you used to use dial-up ISPs? So they would have a bank of modems and they wrote it. And my aha moment, so behind a product is an inciting moment that changes the architecture. So what I did was, I moved the internet, modem and all into the exchange. Now it took me 6 years to sell it, because people in the telephone network didn't really see how they were using it. And I could see that this was going to be a big thing, You could start to see people, like the phone was designed as a network to drop your call after an hour, because they didn't want somebody to complain that there was a long distance call. But if you were doing dial-up, you didn't want it to drop. You know what I mean? So that aha moment dropped the cost to a quarter, and it also allowed broadband to come. Then another product when I became responsible for forecasting was for partnerships and technology foresight, was that I went and developed a proposition to do clinical trials online. Anybody work in pharmaceuticals here? Okay. Now, if you think about it, for blockbusters, so I come in, BT's making all these normal products, sell you call minutes or dial-up or whatever. And Bill Murphy says, I want you to develop solutions, new solutions. So I started looking at industries like the pharmaceutical industry. And they develop blockbuster products like Zantac, or any of you use any regular products. Each of these are multi-billion pound lines. Now the biggest problem is that it takes a minimum of 18 months to go through a clinical trial. And the aha moment was, what if we did it online? So I went and found a company called Face Forward and developed that as a proposition, because even if you knocked a year off, it was worth £1 billion to them. Now the big inside change was that normally clinical trials and the regulator was not looked as a customer, but an abstraction. But by changing that mindset and going and saying, if you do them online, so if you look today now, this is how they're done. Okay, so that's an example. So I've developed a whole range of products, from phone networks to intranets. We launched the intranet, productizing. So, and I work on a lot of startups. The big issue is, what is the pain or the desire of the customer? Am I resonating with you? Does it make sense? So you may have an aha moment that your subconscious picks up. So let me give you an example. How many of you guys have one of these? Does everyone here have a roll on, roll off? Do you know how this was developed? Okay. Do any of you remember buying a separate a trolley that you used to attach to the? Yeah. Do you remember that? Okay. Now, this is a Travel Pro. This was invented by a pilot. So what happened was that obviously as a pilot he's going in and out of the airports, and he notices that people struggling with their bags, and particularly for captains and pilots who are on the plane practically every second day. So now he had to get it through. I won't take you to the whole story, but that's the insight that he had as a user. Does that make sense? And I think they turned over around 100 million. He's quite a rich guy now. right? Because then he started solving, how am I going to do it? Shall I attach a trolley? Will the airlines allow it to go through the X-ray machine? How heavy will it be? And then the smart thing he did was, he didn't go to Chinese manufacturer and ask them to make it all in one. What he did was, he got different people to give different parts, and then he assembled it so that nobody could steal his idea. Is that an interesting story? So the most important thing is, your subconscious can pick up ideas about pains and needs, or if you open your eyes. So if you look at the person who invented, usually what tends to happen is when you're very close to your job, you'll only pick at the minutiae pain. You have to step back, like the woman who invented the wiper. Anyone familiar with the story about the wiper? Look it up, invention of the wiper. And then after that, the evolution starts to cascade. But she wasn't working with him. She wasn't a tam driver of that. She just noticed, oh my God, it's always dirty. Wouldn't it be great? Because all the people who were driving the things, they used to carry a cloth and wipe it. Can you imagine driving a car? And then beforehand, when the cars came out, do you remember they used to wear goggles? Huh? And then the goggles would get dirty. So the windscreen gets invented, then the windscreen gets dirty, so you invent the wiper, then the wiper gets dust, so you invent the spray. Do you see how the problems evolve? Is this making sense? So, another key issue that causes a lot of conflict and a lot of the issues in the use of tools and frameworks is to avoid the conflict of gut decisions. So you might make a decision by gut decision, by analysis, or get some analyst to give a report, or just by popular vote, right? Or it may be that these repeated requests come in from the sales department, or there's a common problem from customer support. One of the interesting things that used to happen in BT is whenever they changed the feature in the network or whatever, call numbers to the fault department went up 40 to 60% like that. Because whenever you change something, people thought it was broke. So once something is out there, changing customer expectations and educating them becomes an important part. Okay? So another way you have to do is you have to look at the, any of you came to my talk on impact mapping? One of the ways you do and prioritize your stack is you look at either the critical path, which is the quickest way around it, or the impact map. Okay? Because I've got a lot of material, I just want to leave these as thoughts, because you just need to search for it on the internet. Any of you have done critical path analysis or critical paths in project plans? Okay. Any of you come across Kano? Yeah. So Kano was all about mapping needs into three categories: expected needs, normal needs, exciting needs. And nowadays in a world where emotion creates motion, this can offer you the most things. So if you think about it, these are the things that they're unhappy with, so you meet the needs. These are the things that they'll be satisfied with, and these are the things that will delight them. Okay? And before I move off all these other things, I do want to take you through QFD as well, because that's a really powerful voice of the customer methodology. Because what I haven't talked an awful lot about is everything has a trade-off. Whenever you design something, either it costs you more money or team, or it conflicts with another requirement. One of the funniest projects I remember, my ex-wife worked for the company and they got a bid for the government for a word processing. Now this goes back to the 80s, so you'll have to excuse me. But what PA Consulting had done was put out a tender, and they'd taken all the best features of all the word processing and put that as a tender requirement, right? So I'd like it to look expensive, and I'd like to be cheap, and I'd like it yesterday. Some things conflict with each other, right? And this is the trouble with people making wish lists. You're smiling. Not because I'm handsome, so so what is it that made you smile?
It's just making me think of all the projects and all the long wish lists I've had to try and compete for people and
You see,
couldn't.
the problem is the corporate said, if we give people budgets and they have to pay for it, then they might choose. And we've all been brought in the mantra that the king is king. But actually, most things are actually done for the core group in a company, which is the board. So,
Can you still apply Moscow to a wish list? Can you still go through that process of saying what actually is your...
yeah, I'm going to come through that. It's also on the list, all right? But the really important issue is sometimes the political requirements in your organization, and governments particularly. How many people here would vote to continue with the National Children's Hospital with a budget of 2 billion? Can you please put your hands up if you would, or how many people would like to drop the project and start again? Right? So you're quite happy to pay the taxes for the rest of your life. Yes? You know what I mean? For God's sake, you could fly every child. There's only 400 beds in that hospital, so even if it was full up, I mean, I'll give you an alternative. Do you know how much the most expensive state-of-the-art hospital ship costs? 100 million. There's a free pier in Bangalore. Let's put it there. Do you see what I'm saying? But the reason that it went there was that the doctors want to keep on working and they're there. Right? So things aren't always done for the best mind in the customer. Right? And whether it's politics or how many times have you had IT projects or campaigns in a company that's a hobby horse or a political requirement? Am I making sense? All right? So what you try to do is to create a decision-making framework, and that's what roadmaps can do. So if you follow it as a process, you will probably get a more sane output than a heavily politicized agreement on what the requirements are. There's a couple of people nodding. Does this make sense? Right? So the thing is, you have to start with company vision, then your strategy, which can, because sometimes a strategy can be met easier by a company doing an acquisition, right? Sometimes it can be by change of use of an existing product. What's the best example of a change of use of a product that's made billions? Viagra. You know what Viagra was originally invented for?
Heart condition.
Blood pressure. It's so good to have you laugh. It makes my day. Thank you very much. So, if everything starts, it's an alignment process. And then when you go, you appeal to that issue. Earlier on, somebody said, how do I make decisions about dropping things off? And he thought I was joking when I said use the Tinder model. Remember?
I didn't think you were joking. I thought it was funny.
Right? So, if you have too much choice, you can't make a decision. So the easiest thing to do is to go and pair them and choose which one to drop. I mean, there's other methodologies, and QFT is much more sophisticated, but I'll come to that later on because it's such a big area to cover. But so if you're in doubt, just say which one you have to lose till you whittle down to the last one or the last three. Okay? And another framework that you can do. So, like I said, I worked on all these projects. So I launched FIRE, which was program management. So because I started with a clear vision, the team could delegate and make decisions. Whether it's to do with UX design, whether it's to do with database design, clarity of vision means you just go back to the original goal. And then you can trust people to do the right thing. Am I talking rubbish here? Does that make sense? Speak up, guys.
Yes.
Right? So the point is, what causes the grief about companies or Brexit or whatever is when there isn't a common goal on what it means to be Britain or Ireland or whatever. But if the management have done their job right, then all the decisions are very easy to validate there, and then to go back to the customers, is there still a market in that space that you want to occupy? So let's take an example of or what looked like a good idea but failed the reality test. Okay? So how many of you have work in an airline? Hands up. Okay. So, any of you familiar with the Airbus? Is it the Airbus 380? Okay. Now, the Airbus, has anybody ever been on an Airbus A380? Okay, so please tell me what you thought of it.
The A380.
No, hold it.
It's British Airways A380, it was fantastic.
So what's different compared to other planes? Just walk through the user perspective.
It was bigger than the average seat. The kids got crayons to play with. The overall it was more legroom. It just felt like a luxurious flight, and it was an absolutely average flight.
Right? But the point is, they ticked all the marks that you would like when sitting in a plane. Yes?
Yeah.
Better than anything else. But it failed because it failed the business model. So the underlying assumption was that aircraft slots were limited. So because the slots were limited, because you know when companies buy airlines, do you know how much each slot is worth? It works in the millions. The slot is more expensive than a plane. Right? So if you can't get a slot to Heathrow, so the A380 was about slots would be limited because time would be limited, so you couldn't run multiple planes. And because it didn't pass that model, and so what airlines are doing is flying 2 planes or smaller flights and flying more frequently than trying to load up a big plane. And so if a plane can take 500 seats but they can only sell 100 or 200 for that slot, it's flying empty all the time. Is this resonating with you? Bringing it to life? Okay, so you have to go back. There are assumptions behind each product or model. Okay, so for example, let's take mobile phones. If you go to India or you go to Brazil, you are prohibited from having these plans. 2-year that you can't break out of. How many of you have a telephone with a plan which gives you a free upgrade? Right? And that's prohibited by law. So if there's nobody subsidizing the payment over 24 months, how many people are going to shell out for £1,000 phone up front? How many people pay full price for a £1,000 phone? Or do you buy it as part of a plan? Do you follow what I'm saying? So behind everything is a business model, strategy, goals, vision. When you have clarity about that, it's a lot easier to make the decisions about that features and so on that you need to. Okay. Marks and Spencers. The reason I mentioned Marks and Spencers was one of the things that they wanted and suppliers wanted was a roadmap, because when their IT department were demanding, how many people provide software used by enterprises? So how many people are asked by their suppliers for a roadmap? Okay. Which company does not give you a roadmap publicly to customers? Google. Do you know why? Because it kind of becomes a contractual thing, and it would preclude them from terminating services. So you take it at your own risk. I was developing a product and I went to Google and I said, could you give me a route map for Google Maps? Microsoft could give me one for theirs, but Google refused to, right? Because they wanted the option to turn it off. Okay? I talked about clinical trials, startups, etc. So one of my big challenges when I was productizing EHR, so I developed the EHR model, but Accenture as a company culture made its money by selling updates and contracting and so on. So even though it was a good idea, and you look at the valuation of those companies, the culture was, the bonus and everything was made by selling a big IT project, you know. So I mean, maybe it's changed now, but that was the world then. We talked about the customer journey, we talked about the loop, tools, templates. So, think of it as a hierarchy. Get your vision, where are you now, where is it going? Think of your strategy. And that's why you need to think about things like product portfolios and common architectures. And if you're building a platform, and it doesn't matter whether it's an A380 or whether it's a hosting platform for services, like Zendesk or whatever. Then comes your product strategy. Then the roadmap is the really important thing, because if you are developing it right, it's not a wish list, it's not a features list, it's us agreeing that we want to fly to Japan, the plane is going to stop off in London. Does this make sense? Right? And use it as a communication and a buy-in tool. And it has to encompass all the functions. Because only then can sales or marketing or the UX people play their part in it. Does this make sense? So if you're the UX department and you know the product's going to be there, you can build your design language and your user interface. Is this making sense? Right? So if you look at it, do you know why? UX is a language that you have with your customer. Your mobile phone is your handshake with your customer. Right? That language is how you talk with the customer, just like you have a language inside your company. And once the customer understands it, you train them to respond to it like you trained your dog to respond to their name. Does it make sense? Whereas if they keep on going, where the hell was that? And I want to buy it. Right? Especially for particular tasks when we talk about roles. If it's a particular task like buying an airline ticket, you have two choices. Either using dark patterns, and we'll come to that and all those hooks, right? And we'll talk about the Ryanair black patterns if you want another talk. I just have to make sure I'm not streaming it then. Okay? But the core point is that for most tasks, if you're building an EHR platform, the guy just wants to go and book his holiday. He doesn't want to be taken around. I remember when I went to work in Hungary, they had a Commodore, and they built an inventory system, and every time we changed it, it would do bells and whistles and special effects. It was like a gaming platform, right? Another time, when I built a planning system for British Gas, and a partner came in, he said, every time we change a menu, we want a splash screen. Now when a customer just wants to go ahead and he's doing a repetitive task, he doesn't want interruptions and splash screens. Right? How many of you make a product and decide to put a splash screen? If it's a utility product, you don't need 4 seconds of ta-da, do you? So it's very easy to rule it out, isn't it? What's the value of the ta-da? Now if you're trying to build a brand and make a different story, then that goal comes in. But if you're saying this is all about the customer, so be clear about it. You may put it in. Yes?
How do you change the mindset of the business who are focused on revenue and delivering what they think is the solution to a problem?
Well, now that's...
How do you get them thinking of it?
Okay, so that's about shuttle diplomacy. When I managed change, I had a very big job to convince all the senior management to explain what the internet was. Okay. Right? So I did two things. Okay, and this is how we sold EHR. The person who's wanting to thrust and prove themselves is usually the number two. So they will get the business benefit if you show it to them. Right? So when I started going to personnel, do you know the aha moment with Tracy Flashman was when she bought a Beanie Baby online for her kids. So suddenly, and then for her to have the aha moment that there were 600 phones that could be put online and we wouldn't need a warehouse, that I didn't have to tell it. When you tell a customer, you take away their autonomy. It's slightly different here if I'm telling you, but because you want to learn, right? But if I tell you that you have to drink this cup of tea or coffee, most people revolt against it, right? And for the CEOs, there are 3 or 4 common things. What is the average decision framework of a minister or a CEO? I call it the rule of 1/3. Okay? So most people will sit down and plan in their career that they've got 2 years in the job. Am I right? How long do you plan your career for? 2 years ahead? Or do you know where you'll be in 20? Anyone know where they'll be in 20 years' time? I'll be in a grave. Okay. But other than that, you can't be sure, can you? Right? So, but you can appeal to the pocket. So if I showed you, later on if you want, I'll show you, I did a whole bunch of presentations about how the share price of all these .coms was going up. And I used to drop little messages. You know, today we call it content marketing. So I used to drop little emails to update them. And then you plant the idea so that the aha moment comes through to them and you have to let them take credit. So if you're goal-driven, give away the idea. That's what Jesus did. He didn't charge anybody to go and like the evangelists do. Right? Is this making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, this is why I said good product managers, good project managers are change agents. Okay. Just have to keep conscious of the time. You've been very patient. Thank you very much. So, you can talk about, do you guys use a feature list? A project plan, Trello, Slack, Kanban, release plan? Huh? Now, that is not a project plan, right? The project plan is the ultimate entry. So, one of the other things we talked about is ideas. They also copied this idea when developing design sprints. Do you know what this one is? Very simple way to sell, right? This is the return from a project, and this is the effort, right? So if you've got a low effort and low effort and high returns, it's very easy to get by. And you can make it more complicated, like an expected value model, which takes account of risk and so on. Okay? Because going back to the CEO's model, the CEOs sit down and say, I'm here for 2 years. I don't want to start a project that my successor is going to get all the credit for. Do you see that with government minister policies? In the old days, it used to be, oh, we'll do 5 and 10-year plans. But the reality is most CEOs are driven by their bonus and their stuff. If you can show them that this will enhance the share price or make them more marketable and get a win. But that's a different story to the number 2. So each person has to be sold a different story. And you don't do that in a public document, you do it face to face in shuttle diplomacy. Right? And like a politician, so I know you probably think I'm being very sarcastic or whatever, but you've got to talk in their language, in something that relates to them. You know, their bonus is going to go up there. So if you're trying to get sales on board, you're going to show the right story to sales. Okay, if you're going to sell it to engineering, am I making sense? So, like I said, focus on the vision and that. So, another model you can look up, and it'll be very easy for you to find. Look up, and if you come across a chap called Geoffrey Moore. Geoffrey Moore was, when the whole .com thing came out, he wrote a couple of books about like the 800-pound gorilla, but the biggest one was called Crossing the Chasm. Anybody come across the chasm model? No? Okay. So, normally what you tend to do is you come across this curve, bell-shaped curve, so you've got your early adopters and your laggards. And usually what happens is a new technology comes on board, and this was the big problem. And they all loved it, but they couldn't sell it to the majority. And this was called the chasm. Okay? So he also wrote a thing which is called an elevator pitch template, which a lot of people use. But really what it does, whether you use impact mapping, is if your roadmap can say, why am I doing it, what am I doing, who am I doing it for, when am I doing it, where am I doing it, you're halfway there, right? There's a bit more of a, so if you go on the internet, you'll find things like this. Okay, lots of people have their own derivative things, but that's what it comes to. You know, like if you want, I can go back to the history of the history of the histories, you know, but we're trying to cover it and we're running out of time. Another key thing that you will see in product hunt use is and so on, but these are really what I call innovation patterns, which are themes, right? So, for example, there's a theme for a phone to get thinner. How long has the thin theme been going? Or making it smaller? You see what I'm saying? So, certain things in society, any of you have done an MBA? Okay, so do you know what PEST is? Can you speak it up?
Esther?
PEST, yeah. Go on, explain it to people. Political,
Political, external.
economic, social, technological, right? So, if you start to look at patterns, you will start to get a backdrop. Okay? So whether you're talking about the green theme, you know, your industry has certain patterns, right? So you could sit down and say, like Motorola invented the whole concept of Six Sigma, but the driver behind that was every year they wanted to drive the product price down by 10%. Okay? So you can sit down and say, what are the broad themes or the innovation patterns? And I run a special course on helping teach you figure that out. Okay? So what's the difference between a user and a buyer?
Decision making.
Okay, so what's the best example of a user versus a buyer? How many of you have kids? Okay, so kids go to school, they're the user, but they don't pay for it. In fact, they'd probably like to be paid to go there. But that's an example. So understanding the different hats that people wear. So when I design a system, I design with the role in mind. But when I have to sell to them, I have to understand the user persona. Is that making sense? Okay, so if you were designing the system, there's two elements, the functional aspect to do the job, right? So let's take a good example of what we built into the systems, which by the way, none of the airlines have, and if you use it, you owe me. Everybody, it's on tape, all right? So if you think about it, how many people get their secretary to book their flight? Okay, so a lot of products, when they first came out and you still had staff doing the stuff, would have secretaries, right? Or if you're using Google or whatever, you might want to defer those rights to somebody else. You might want to own the account and allow them to do booking, but you don't want them to see all the pictures. So you have a different role. So they may be an operator and you may be the end user or vice versa. So that determines the different points. So when I design systems, you allow different things, right? So the best common platform that you design would be, let's take a telephone network. So when you ring Vodafone, what you want is, you can do it yourself as end user, but you also want somebody else, if they call telephone support, and the same database has the same stuff on it, but this time it's written that John rang and he changed the account privilege, or he changed the plan they were on. Do you see what I'm saying? So you're using the same functionality, but you have to record extra data because the role has been delegated to a third party, maybe in your company. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So that way you only design one system rather than, okay? So the other thing we talked about was the persona. So persona is more about who is the person, right? So when you're selling to the Porsche, are you worrying about the marketing to the persona, or are you worrying about the role? Am I making sense? Don't confuse the two.
Can you explain what the different role or persona would be for the Porsche? Because it makes sense for the kids in school, you know.
No, well, persona is different from role. It's not a role, it's just a different way to look at it.
Okay.
Right? A lot of this thing was taken, and I started with this through storyboarding. One of the projects I worked on, anybody ever seen Jakers, the cartoon? Go and have a look at it. That was one of the projects I kicked off. But when we went to Cartoon 2000 or whatever, I sat down with the person, a chap called Ralph Hibbert. And Ralph Hibbert did a very successful set of cartoon series. I said, how do you design? He said, I put a picture of the kid who's going to watch my cartoon in front of me on my table. So he always had the end user in mind. So then when he was designing, because when you go to the animation industry, for example, of films, when you're young, you see people in very single, Mr. Happy or the Smurfs, they're one-dimensional people. Whereas when you go to watch a big film, people are complicated and they've got their problems and so on. And half the reason you watch a film is that insight. So the more insightful you are about understanding your person and their situation, right? You get a better map on how to market to them, how to sell to them. It's a soft issue.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite getting why would you separate persona and role?
You're not separating, you're just taking a different perspective. All right, if you look here, right?
Yeah.
And I can sit down and I asked a whole bunch of questions at the beginning, how many are from big companies and large companies. But if I want to get you on board to my course, I need to appeal much more to you as a person, that you're a father,
Sure, yeah.
right? That this is going to help you in your job as a father, and so on. Am I making sense? You don't have to do this if...
Yeah.
Sorry? What is it, John? Go ahead.
I just want to make a comment that when we design a role, we need many personas to understand the role. For example, the administration role you said before, maybe John, that's the persona, or Mary, or someone else, or Patrick, whatever. And you can understand their lifestyles, their ages, whatever they are. So to design a role, and to understand all these different personas that are humans, and they can actually be the ones that will have the role. I just want to...
Okay, so this is the person, and this is what they do. Does that make sense? Is that given any clarity? Okay.
Yeah, but, so if you put it, dissect it.
Could I suggest you come back afterwards? Because
Okay.
Is that all right? I'm
Yeah.
not trying to avoid your
That's
question.
right.
Okay, because it'll take a bit longer. Okay. So another thing when you do is your stakeholders, like when I was doing fire, you have to make sure it's received. So you have a core team that is delivering the product, but it's in a context that it needs supporters. It might be the chief executive, it might be the PR person, it might be the salespeople. So map out your community, because they all play a part. And if your roadmap is to be accepted, because really what you're doing is saying, we're going to America, we're going there by ship, and we're going to go this route. And if we get blown away, this is how we'll do a course correction. Does that make sense? And this is where we're going to fill up for water, or this is where we're going to deck out. Any other questions? So, and like I gave you the example in the clinical trials, look at the regulator and the media. So the degree to which you disclose and think about them in your customer, right? So the clinical trials customer was the regulator, and the goal was to get the product out of the door quicker. So to automate it, you simplified it there, and you looked at him as a super customer, right? So I don't know how many of you, when you design your products, think about, like, airlines are regulated. Most businesses have a degree, banking is regulated, but how you position it and see them as a customer and a stakeholder in designing your product will get you through the gates faster. Otherwise, remember, projects aren't stopped by the people who want it to go. Projects are stopped by the people who are threatened by it. That's a generic issue, whether it's in politics or government. Right? So we talked about different stakeholders, customers, again, these are all the internal ones. Okay, can everybody read that? So I'll just rush through it, is that okay? So, early on I talked about the product life cycle. So remember I gave you the analogy about you doing a slingshot via the planets and you want to go to Jupiter, right? So think about when you're launching it, And that sets the tone. So the most important decision for a startup or a project is who is your seeding customer and how do you seed your network? How do you make your product ready to be receptive, whether it's an internal project? So sometimes, like when I launched Fire, I picked the most critical people because everybody knew they were critical, and if they accepted the product, then everybody else would too. Sometimes you actually use your enemies this way, but you have to be very confident about it. Okay, so you've come across the Boston Consulting Grid. So the route map, when you're doing your roadmap, you may have a lot of clarity about the next release, but then the product has to change to go. So think about Apple. Has Apple broadened its constituency? Yes? No?
Yes.
Right? Same thing happened with airline flights, yes? No? And that's what causes it to change, so you design it that way. Okay? And I talked about how long your product is going to be in the air or in the wild. Okay? So another thing is to figure out how will you know you've succeeded. Okay, so you need some success metrics. So, to go back to the earlier thing about profit, when you take a product portfolio approach, you build a lifetime income and say, this product will be used for so long, then I'm going to reuse this family. So if you look at Apple, Apple has been incrementally building its iOS, each build. So when you're building Windows or software, it's evolving and you're getting a lifetime of income out of that. But then when you make your next iPhone, you'll be reusing the same screen. You have to do that also with your airline. I'm going to do a refit internally. I'm going to rebrand it. So, you need to factor that evolution. So I'm going to rip out first class seats and make them all economy. So if you're buying a plane, you do that. If you're doing a hotel, you do that. Is this making sense? So earlier on I talked about Kano. My apologies that it's all over the place, but this is what we talked about, the Kano map. Okay, if you look at that, you'll find lots of data on it. I don't want to do QFT. So another map that you did is this one about feasibility. So I do this also about how to pick new ideas. So is it feasible? Is it desirable? Is it viable? So when you scatter your projects, you can use tools. So the thing you have to be careful is when a system sets in, it's like the law, it's like the government. The intent may have been good, but what people will do is they will fudge the system, right? If you write a business case, which business is going to say it doesn't give 100% return? Because everybody learns how to fudge the numbers. Remember the classic line of how to get hired as a finance director, okay? You know the story about how a guy got hired as a finance director. Company's looking to go IPO, so puts an ad in the FT, wanted somebody from the Big Four, high flyer, so puts out an ad, and all these people come in for interviews. So the guy, the CEO, shoves the papers and says, what's the profit? Oh, sit down, do the profit. He says, no, no, no. And then the last guy comes in, and he thinks, oh my God, another one of these things. He shoves the thing. The guy shoves the papers back at him, looks him in the eye and says, what would you like it to be? So bear in mind that if something gets systemized, people know how to fiddle the system. And that's what you've got to be careful of. So if you have a thing and somebody has their project, they will skew it to get it through.
Just to clarify, are you saying the way frameworks and
No, look, what I said to you guys earlier on was you need to think of these as tools. And that's what they are. They're there for a job. Don't get wedded to it. Otherwise, if the only tool you got is a hammer, and you'll see every problem as a nail. Is that making sense? Right? So that's all I'm saying about it, right? So when you see somebody getting overly dependent on the tool and the process, right? So is the law at the moment about justice or is it a process? I'll let you answer that for yourself. So this was what we were talking about earlier on about must have, should have, could have. And the point I was trying to make is a lot of the frameworks like Lean and all do not take account of ecosystems and dynamic. They do not understand, and I'm going to cover QFD about trade-offs. Look, if you've got a finite budget, you can either choose to have a bigger battery or a better screen. Okay, but the bigger screen will eat the battery even more. You know, like when you started making laptops that were smaller, then the battery life went longer because they also had smaller screens. You see what I'm saying? So some things to understand these trade-off matrices, when we talk about QFD, so my thing is, use the tool that is appropriate. Don't try to eat the soup with a fork. Okay? Otherwise you'll be there a long time. Anybody eat soup with a fork? Obviously. But, so, I want to go to the QFD thing very quickly as well. So, talked about the desire of feasibility. So, the big issue that we talked about was about shuttle diplomacy and about it being a bind. So think about it as this is a tool, and then you'll have different versions that you give to different people, and it's a journey, and you're using it as a decision-making process. And you're using it as a thinking tool. Am I making sense? The output isn't how pretty this document looked. And if it's live, so each organization should have a different document depending on, so should it be a spreadsheet or whatever, right? That's not the output. The output is the leanest way, the lowest overhead to get you to the goal you're looking for. Does that make sense? If anybody disagrees with me, please tell me, okay, because then I can answer it, okay? So another way is to look at it in terms of goal, reality, way forward. When we started working, what we always tried to do was to involve people, and we did what was called a joint application development. Okay, we're running out of time. So I've got 2 minutes, okay, so let me just rush you through. One of the things also is, there's a danger with route maps if you give them to your customers. You know what happens? It's called the Osborne effect, right? Most IT people do it anyway in a different way. They'll say, I'll wait till the update has happened. I'm not going to update my Apple right away. I'll wait to see if it doesn't crash or a bug. But the Osborne effect is, I'll wait till the next release. I'm happy with this. So be careful of that. That's why I said you have to look at it with marketing as well. So we talked about sharing the roadmap. I gave you the example. Some products only have one. Other times, like you see with Android, it ends up with forks. But really, this is a tool to help you manage expectations of your stakeholders. So first you've got to get alignment, agreement, and then use it to empower yourself. Is that making sense? Okay, so there's one other thing I just need to show you, which is House of Cards, but then you can look it up yourself. There's two different versions, but this is the simpler one. What this does is it says, what are the customer requirements? Can you read this at all?
No.
All right, okay. Very quickly, but go online. It's a really nice way to look at this. So what it says is you put your customer requirements on the left, and you also rank them in importance. Okay? And then what you do is you say, how are you going to make it happen? And then you can multiply this by this and figure out which bits to do. You know what I mean? So you may have 10 requirements, but one requirement is more important. And the way you satisfy it And this house of card tells you what the trade-off matrices. If you're having to use a bigger battery, so if you're making it lighter, then you have a smaller battery, there's a trade-off. Am I making sense? Right? So you have those issues there. So I need to wrap up, guys.
Sorry, what should we search for to find this?
Quality function deployment.
We can send it in an email tomorrow if you want. As well.
You're going to do it right.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not trying to add to my work, guys. All right. So, did you guys enjoy this?
Yeah.
You did? All right. So can I ask a favor of you? Can you go to the meetup and say it was a great event? If I ran a course on this route map over a day or two, how many would like to come and get it? All right, okay. Well,
Just this.
okay. Well, like I said, not everything is suitable. This has fallen out of fashion. This is actually very, very old. But the thing is, when we used to do requirements capture, you'd always go and say, what's the requirement and how important is it? Right? You've come across those old methodologies. The software that used to do that was called Which and Why. This is the trouble when you've been at this game for a long time. Okay, so there's a lot more stuff that I know that I work with. I'll drop you guys an email. We have other events coming on, but give me a quick show of hands. Would you recommend this to anyone else?
Yeah.
Okay. But that was the wrong answer, because you are the only ones who should know about it. Right? Because knowledge is about stuff. There's two types of knowledge, the one that gives you an edge and the one you want everybody else to have. All right? So I hope this gave you some edge. Yes? No?